Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we're discussing the upcoming movie about Bob Dylan, A Complete Unknown. By now, you've probably heard quite a bit about Timothée Chalamet's extraordinary performance, but I got to check out the screening of the film this week, and I've got to say, the sound design and mix are also simply incredible. So today, I'm thrilled to welcome to the podcast the film's supervising music editor, Ted Caplan, production sound mixer Todd Maitland, Academy Award-winning supervising sound editor Don Sylvester, Academy Award-winning re-recording mixer Paul Massey, and the director, two-time Academy Award nominee James Mangold, who was also a writer and producer on the film. James, of course, did Walk the Line back in 2005, along with Ted, Don, and Paul, who all returned to work on this film with him. So this movie was officially greenlit way back in 2019, and it was originally going to be James's next film after he did Ford versus Ferrari. But then COVID happened, and actor commitments, and James went off to make Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. So then this movie came together again, but stopped because of the actor strike. So even though this has been a go movie for several years, they actually filmed the movie this spring, wrapping in June. So it was a really tight post-production schedule to get to the theaters by Christmas. Here's director James Mangold talking about the schedule.
It's a challenge, but it's also, from the point of view of a producer and the director, it's got its advantages and its disadvantages. The disadvantages are time is of the essence, yes, and decisions have to be made. And that's, but the advantages are that, what would be my choice? My choice would be moving quickly with a crew I've worked with many times. Editors I've worked with on many pictures, and making decisions and finishing the picture, or making the movie finishing in a month later, because that's all, a post schedule on a mid-price movie is going to allow for anyway. We'd be finishing in January. And then what happens? The movie sits and people pick at it and they second guess it because it's not going to come out in the summer. This picture will be fall of the next year. So then I have an added problem, which is I have a movie that is going to be sitting like a ripe tomato with people scratching their heads and looking at it and wondering. And to me, moving quickly and making decisions quickly, it's scary. But I always imagined if we got into trouble and the movie wasn't looking good, the studio would just go, forget it. We're not coming out in December. But the reality for me is that movies are less often damaged by not having a few more days in one process or another, but more by, as often at least, if not more often, by having too many heads in the kitchen because the turkey is sitting there on the counter for hours. And so for me, that I wanted to go for it for that reason. And as these guys know, I like to kind of, make a decision and not lollygag around, hemming and hawing and living like Humpty Dumpty on the wall for too long.
Jim, I can imagine for you, like one of the when you're thinking about making a movie about Bob Dylan, I can imagine the first question that you have to really ask and wrestle with is, how are we going to handle these songs? And I'm curious, we talked a little bit about Walk the Line. You had a very similar approach, which is you're working with actors who may not necessarily be known primarily as vocal singers, delivering these iconic, very recognizable vocal performances. Did you understand from the very beginning of the process that you wanted the actors to live sing and to perform the instruments? Or was there ever a moment when you were like, maybe we would lip sync this?
I didn't know we'd live sing at the beginning. I just knew I wanted them to sing. And the rest came along with the development that Timmy and Monica they're the ones who carried the greatest burden in terms of singing, who were playing Bob and Joan respectively. And the thing is that whenever you do press in a movie, everyone asks you questions, and maybe it's easier for the guys in post because you kind of go, we did this and then we did this. But over the 5 years, it's an evolving set of landscapes where you're making decisions based on the talent that gets revealed, the landscape of the money, the schedule. So And at the early stage you're talking about, at the very beginning, I knew I wanted the actors to sing. I knew I wanted that. But there's a difference between knowing what you want and necessarily getting it. Meaning, I didn't know I'd achieve it. I didn't know that we wouldn't run into a problem where one of the actors really couldn't sing the parts. But there's no way to discover that if you don't try to do it. And so if you start waving the flag of voice alikes or kind of replacing them at the beginning, you're letting the actor off the hook of the pressure to deliver. And you're also kind of just lowering the bar, in my opinion, because particularly, in relation to the movie that some of these folks worked on, the Queen movie, it's a different movie, right? Meaning you have these large production songs that are they're part of the magic of that group is the elaborate nature of the production of the music. This is the opposite, right? This is one guitar and a person singing, and that's it. And so that the layers, the fig leaves of protection you have, if you start using, for me, the reason you're leaning into doing it for real as much as the actor and technology will allow is because the movie is about an authentic human voice alone with a guitar in a room. The music we're emulating is not, no one writes home about the sonics of freewheeling. It's like that's not what that album was about. It's not like someone goes, oh my God, could we talk about the production on Bob's first album? It's a guy with a mic in an empty room and a guitar. What you're really talking about is the authenticity and humanity and uniqueness of expression of this singular voice and guitar. And at that point, when you're making a movie about people like that, and the same goes for Joan or Pete Seeger or any of the characters who are singing, I kind of am like, I honestly go, how could you do it any other way, really, and not have it sound like a variety, like a bad lip sync on a variety show from the 70s? It's just kind of, to me, all the risk was in trying to do it with the default settings of playback and on a creative level, because it seemed like, what happens if I discover Timmy can't sing this one song or Monica can't hit this one note? Well, do we re-orchestrate the song to a different key? Possible. Who's going to be upset? Or B, do we then deal with it? Do we get him in and loop those phrases and just kind of have him fix it in post when he can just work on getting his voice to hit that? Well, neither of those things really happen to any degree, but those would all be solutions that are available to me, even in post. I mean, frankly, you could have someone playing the song and it could be a disaster in production and you could completely replace the guitar and the voice in post. So I'm not trying to make myself sound less sexy and holding to this kind of hardcore, but it really isn't you're really just going, what would be the right thing if we could achieve it? And then you go for that. And there's all these ways to mitigate where you could come up short, but you're still you're having a high bar for yourself of what you're hoping to achieve in the actor. And it really falls upon them, what they can achieve.
Paul and Donald, one of the questions that I had for you guys is, you've worked with James for a long time. All three of you guys worked on Walk the Line. And I know you had kind of a similar situation where you had, actors who are not principally known for singing, doing these kind of iconic vocals. And so I wondered, what did you learn from Walk the Line that kind of informed how you were going to approach A Complete Unknown?
I think it's Jim's aesthetic. I mean, I think the thing we got from working with Jim for all these years is that he wants it to be raw. He wants it to be a story. He wants it to be immediate. He doesn't need it to be clean. He doesn't want it to all be rounded. I mean, the things he says not to do is don't round it off. Don't make it sound perfect. Like, he wants the life in everything. So whether it's Timmy's vocals, whether it's guitar, I'm sure, I can't remember all the way back to Walk the Line, but Paul, you can tell me if I'm right. I mean, it was always about the life of the sound of the music, and it's never, with Walk the Line and this movie, it was never an impersonation of a famous character. It's an embodiment of somebody, the spirit of somebody, and trying to catch that. And so Timmy's not doing a Bob Dylan impersonation. That would be hard to watch. It's an embodiment of the spirit of him, so that he can make it his own. And that, keeping it raw, keeping it alive, and not not overproducing it, not over mixing it, not over cutting it, not over cleaning it. Those are all big Jim aesthetics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ted. I mean, it's a fine line between bringing the professionalism of the sound to a 2024 audience and what they would expect, but also keeping the character and the story, which is so much of what Jim wants in his films. He doesn't necessarily want to have a perfect rendition of what he's seeing literally on screen. He wants to have the character, the little quirks, the little things that go wrong in a live performance. He embraces all of that and loves all of that. And I think that's what keeps this film very grounded. Like Ted said, you're not watching a reenactment of a Bob Dylan concert. You're watching Tim being Bob with all of his quirks that he brings to it as well. And so I think Walk the Line also had a lot of that too, with Joaquin and Reese. And again, capturing the live feel of every single moment. And that's very important to Jim. He doesn't want perfection in every single little phrase or every single little guitar strum. If you hit not a wrong note, but if you hit a squeak on a guitar, or you gliss into the right pitch on a vocal, embrace it, go for it. It's live. It's great.
And you could draw a straight line from Johnny Cash's audition at Sun Studios to Sam Phillips to, Bob singing to Woody Guthrie in the hospital. I mean, the same almost intention, sing a song as if your life depends on it. And that comes across this kind of like immediacy, the realness of it, the drama of it. He catches all of that because they're really playing.
So, Todd, I'd love to get you to talk to us about capturing the live performances in the film. I know that you guys did some pre-records, but it's interesting to me because you kind of got two different flavors of performance scenes. You've got these, you've got some pretty big shows. You've got Carnegie Hall, you've got the big festivals, but a lot of the singing and the performance is really intimate. It's Bob and Joan, in a bedroom, just kind of noodling around with a guitar and singing to each other. So I would love for you to talk about, your process of how you approached doing the live capture for both of those different flavors of performance.
So we approached it in two different ways. One would be those intimate scenes where we knew we didn't have performance microphones, we didn't have stage microphones and amplification and all of that. For those scenes, I had watched Timmy in rehearsals. And in rehearsals, the way that he held the guitar was with the bass of the guitar all the way up high on his body, the way Bob used to play, which meant that there was no room for a wireless microphone at all. So the only way that I could end up miking him was in his hair. So I would run a mic all the way up to the front of his head, just like this. And that worked out perfectly because if you think about it, it's going right by their mouth, right down to the guitar. So I use that in probably 10, 11 situations where it was really just Timmy and the guitar and no stage mics at all. And for the stage mics, we found 45 period practical microphones that were totally functional and that covered the time period from 61 to 65. And we wanted to use different microphones in every venue to get a different texture, a little different feeling for each one. And as time goes on, in the beginning, the microphones have a lot more mid-range to them. They're very, very mid-rangey. And as we know, microphones have gotten more and more bassy, much more fuller as time goes on. So even in that time period, those 4 years, those microphones changed. So we wanted to really show that also and make this thing as real as we possibly could. So by being able to use those practical microphones, and then when they would go off mic, because there are multiple situations where they're on stage and they would go off mic. So we would have everybody wired. We would boom everybody. There were times that I had 40 microphones going. For the final scene for the 1965 Newport Festival, I had 40 microphones going on it. So it was quite an adventure, and really so much about microphone placement.
So that's really interesting. I want to draw a distinction between what you guys are talking about. So you've got, like, at one end, you've got, Paul, you did Bohemian Rhapsody and got an Academy Award for mixing that movie, but that's like at one extreme where you're basically lip syncing, right? That's the original iconic tracks that are being lip synced by the actor. Then you've got pre-records with the actors doing, the vocalizations like in Walk the Line, but this is really live sung on set on the day. And I'm just kind of curious, it just seems like intuitively you're going to get a much more emotional, raw, impactful performance by doing that. But I'm kind of curious for you, Paul, from a mixing perspective, what are the differences for you in those three approaches?
Singing live, first of all, Timothy pulled it off. He did a fantastic job of playing the instruments and singing, and so did Monica as Joan and Pete Seeger. All of the performances are live, which is fantastic, and it keeps it really grounded. I think that the challenges then are making it feel as though it's really in that space, even though it is live. And also when you're singing live and that's all happening and there's PAs playing on location, you're obviously going to get a lot of spill. You're going to get other instrumentation coming into vocal mics, other noises coming into an acoustic guitar mic, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to clean those up but not take them to a studio level is a challenge. And I was just remembering back to, Bohemian Rhapsody, yes, Rami was lip syncing and we used all of, take the Live Aid sequence, for instance. We used all of Freddie's original vocals and then it was Rami lip syncing, and we use excerpts from Rami live on location to get us in and out of phrases. We didn't need to do that here, obviously, because everything was live. All the breaths and the inhales and the mic pops and everything, those were all happening. The intent from Jim was always to make it slightly raw and not to make it perfect. He didn't want it to be studio recordings playing back. He wanted it to feel very alive and raucous and in the moment.
They did pre-record for it. They did plan for that, and then they got there and they're like, no, we can't. Timmy didn't want to do it. Jim didn't want to do it. They wanted to capture a moment in time, and the only way to do it was to get their guitars out and have them, have a drama together, not just do a performance. And that's what you get from, trying this approach. It's complicated in the aftermath, because then you're dealing with, lack of click tracks. You have people playing a little bit different tempos, and you're trying to match mic vocals, and you're trying to do all this work to get it all to fit together. But the benefit of it outweighs the technical challenges that we came into.
And also, Timmy had been living with this for years and years, and he had been maturing too as a singer and a musician. And by the time he got on set, those pre-records were a year old, and he had moved past it, and he had become an embodiment of the character he was playing, and he didn't want to go back. And I don't think anybody blamed him.
How much responsibility did you feel, Jim, that you needed to make these new versions feel very faithful to the versions of the songs that we had always been hearing when we were growing up? Or did you feel like you had the license to kind of reinterpret?
I definitely didn't think we should be reinterpreting the songs, but that sounds like a wholesale abandonment of the way Bob or Joan would have sung them. And no, I don't think we should have done that. But I definitely find myself, I'm sympathetic to both arguments, and both remain valid all through. There's limits to how much you can deviate without it not feeling like the song anymore, right? And I was not, there's not many places I was ever tempted to do that in some way that would that anyone well-adjusted would find objectionable. The where you get into tricky area, if you're asking me, is the fanatical people who want a carbon copy of what's on their record in the movie. No, I don't feel responsibility for them. I feel sympathy. Like, I'm just like, I don't have, if you want to hear the record, go listen to it. Like, it just seems so completely inane to me, that if a dramatization has a goal, which is to be dramatic. But not only that, really, we're not playing many of the songs as they're heard them on the album. I mean, when Bob sings Blowin' in the Wind the first time, it's in a hospital room with Woody Guthrie, and it's only a few lyrics that he's written. And when he sings it a second time, it's with Joan Baez in his apartment. To my knowledge, neither of those performances are available on vinyl or CD or download. And so his first performance of Masters of War at the Gaslight during the Cuban Missile Crisis is not available on recording. I tried desperately to avoid what I call, the Disney Hall of Presidents version of a biopic, in which you kind of recreate historic concerts exactly as they occurred. And we did that to some degree with Newport, but that's kind of it. But these historic moments in music along the way, I almost tried as a writer to try and focus us on the ones you never could have or would have heard. So with false starts and hiccups and all the things that would make them dramatic, and interesting to a viewer. If that answers the question.
It totally does. And, it makes much more sense dramatically. It's much kinder to your actors because you're not asking them to slavishly recreate some, a famous recording performance. And
Well, but also, the funny thing that happens is whether you're talking about the music producer, Nick Baxter, or you're talking about these gentlemen, and every one of them is very attuned to what tube amps and what methodologies were used at the time. And I applaud it, like all the subtle sum of all these small efforts to capture the way it was done then does affect the sound. But with this kind of all my collaborators so focused on that stuff, and my music producer also analyzing every tempo that the original version of, Don't Think Twice occurred on, and making sure that the slight uptick in tempo by 4% after the second verse increases. I only have one role to play that's logical in relation to all these wonderful people who are so focused on this stuff, which is to go, let it go. Let it go. But when this fastidiousness is in the way of quality or drama, then that's the only place where I would throw down my marker firmly on the side of what's more interesting, that doesn't contradict history or reinvent history, but what's the most interesting choice to make in this scene at this moment? Because to me, it's just math. I'm going to have, out of 100 people watching the movie, I'm probably not even going to have 1 per 100 who would, probably not 1 per 1,000, to be honest, who are going to notice the kinds of deviations we made from the originals. So when we did, and that's kind of crazy time. Like if I'm doing something that's going to be entertaining for 999 people and maybe more entertaining, but there's one person who might tweet about the fact that the harmonica solo in the bridge is not the same. Well, I'm so glad that person got a purpose in their life for that day and got a few people to give them a thumbs up on their tweet, and we've helped them feel better about themselves.
You're a very generous man. Very generous.
Yes.
I was curious about your decision to not use a traditional score in the film and to really kind of use Dylan's music almost as if it is score for the movie.
There was just too much music in the movie that to start introducing a whole lot more. Buck Sanders and Ted wrote some pieces. Ted did a lot of work in kind of doing these kind of music meets sound design kind of tonal things, which were about as much as we could bear. The movie could bear, given the sheer tonnage of music, elaborate music that was playing in the movie. We experimented with more elaborate musical pieces. I mean, Paul could attest to that, but it always seemed to be like you just you were really grateful to have moments where things were either free of music or the music was extremely subtle.
There's so many starts, there's so many songs within this film that Jim's absolutely right. We couldn't have too many interconnecting thread moments musically. It just became overwhelming. So I think what Ted and Buck came up with, which almost made it internal in places and didn't get in the way as music per se, as a rhythm, was very effective.
I mean, there are 130-ish song starts on this cue sheet. So adding more might make somebody's head explode. And to Jim's point, also, we wanted the world to feel authentic and not like, here, welcome to the hallowed biopic of Bob Dylan. And we cared more about street sounds and the thing out the window and the car going by than we did about the directors telling you to feel, bad for Bob Dylan or happy for Bob Dylan or whatever. And that's, certainly a testament to Jim's desire for authenticity, for immediacy, and to immerse you in a world rather than to string you along on a tale about the ups and downs of a pop star.
I mean, some music, when it's underlining emotional beats too aggressively, is a staple of Hollywood filmmaking, and in the case of this movie, it just felt like we had, we've said it all. We had a lot of music, and we also would make these wonderful discoveries, which was just how you could start a song and then cut the vocal out and keep going with the instrumental part and carry it over the next scene or two, or keep the song rolling over the next scene or two, or start the song as a piece of score, like There But For Fortune Go I, the Phil Ochs song, this beautiful arrangement that Joan Baez does starts as a piece of score when Woody Guthrie asks Pete Seeger to give this harmonica to Bob, and Pete's kind of dejected about it, and it starts as a kind of scoring of Pete's kind of wounded feelings, and then it carries through a scene of the announcement of Kennedy's death after his assassination, and the mourning quality of that song plays as score through that, and then suddenly you hear Joan Baez singing, and then you're live on stage at Newport 64, and she's singing the Phil Ochs song. And there's many opportunities like that where a combination of the picture editors and Ted and myself just kind of falling into things as the picture shapes up, and things that you just discover, oh my God, we don't need a pre-lap. We can pre-score the previous 90 seconds of the scene, and then suddenly it becomes a song, or vice versa, and, Ted made this discovery with, what is the song? One Too Many Mornings. Yes. One Too Many Mornings. It's this beautiful, most elaborate score piece we have in the movie, which is right at the very end as Bob is leaving Newport and kind of getting on his motorcycle, and Joan confronts him, and then he passes Pete folding chairs at the shutdown band shell. And it's just literally, we had an idea that we were going to record One Too Many Mornings with Timmy, and we never did. But we had this backing track we had made, that Nick had made in prep. And it just was this beautiful piece of score that laid over that.
That's amazing. That's a great story.
A song conceivably he hadn't even written yet at that moment in the movie, which now I've given permission for that to become an issue for someone.
I think, the initial approach, Jim was so excited actually, because, we were doing Indiana Jones, and he says to me, on Bob Dylan, we're going to have no score. Like, couldn't be more opposite than that movie, right? Not that he loved doing Indiana Jones, but he's like, we're going to just work with Bob Dylan songs. We're going to make that the score of the movie. And he loved the challenge of doing that. So it had a holistic idea. As happens, you start cutting the movie together, and we were able to use some of the songs from the movie in different places. We used the Phil Oakes track, There But Fortune, for a piece where Timmy and Monica, kiss, spoiler alert, kiss in the hallway. And there are a couple other spots like that. But, and then we found some other pieces of guitar work that sounded like it could live in that world that weren't exactly Bob tracks, but that felt contiguous with the environment. Specifically, Jim wants raw, immediate sounding guitar. He doesn't want it. He always said to me, I don't want it to sound like Starbucks. So if it sounded like you could hear it in a Starbucks, we never used it, right? Everything had to be Starbucks, de-Starbucksed. And so we have a bunch of tracks that we just tortured into finally finding a sound that, again, it might be played a little aggressively. It might not be so rounded off. It might be sharp. Those are things he loves. And so we found a couple of guitar pieces that worked that way. And then he did ask me at some point, he was asking Dawn and I there was a moment where Bob's punched out, and then he goes into kind of a little internal world, and he wanted to try something kind of sound designy tonal in there. So I made something for that. And that becomes kind of a sound design music blend throughout the movie that you hear come back just a few times, and it's blended with the sound. It's not a scorey orchestral sound. It's really there to kind of subtly guide you into Bob's world, into his mind, into, an internal state that takes you all the way to the electric guitar, and has this kind of subtle nod to feedback. It kind of has these little wailing builds to them to kind of hint that this is where we're going, and this is where Bob is headed. So with a mix of, actual guitar music and some light, score, we tried to not get in the way. That was the main thing. Don't get in the way of the songs. Never feel like we're asserting ourselves in a way that makes it feel schmaltzy or sentimental, and let the Bob stuff obviously be the main event.
Don, one of the questions I had for you is one of the things that struck me about the movie is how much New York City in the early 60s, and the Village specifically, is another character in the film. And obviously it sounds very different now than it did in the early 60s. So our friends at Searchlight gave us an amazing clip. We're in 1965. Bob's walking down the street, just taking all of the magic of this place, and then he finds a kazoo from a street vendor.
Bob.
You got kids?
Yeah. Thousands of them.
It is its own character. Greenwich Village at that time, I missed that time period, but I've lived in the city, for 45 years. And, the city has its own life. Even when you look at older films like, Dog Day Afternoon and all these other films, the city has a much bigger presence in those films because you're not using wireless mics, you're using a lot of boom mics. So you capture a lot of that sound. So thinking back to the way that those films worked, my guys, Jerry and Terrence, they are great at deploying microphones out to capture sound effects. We keep 5 microphones on little stands that are wireless that we can just deploy out like little sound hand grenades and record things. So if there's a car going by over here, somebody's playing little drums over there. For the one scene at night where he's walking by when he buys the kazoo, he walks by, a van where they're playing Puff the Magic Dragon. There's an Indian guy playing a drum over here. There's another guy singing opera over here, and all that was live. We did that entirely live. So we had all of these little vignettes set up, and even beyond that, as he's walking by, there were a lot of underground clubs. So there were stairs that would go down and you see a sign that would say, whichever club. And we'd have music coming out of those. So we'd put different playback in each one of those venues. So we created a real environment. And it's normally a production sound mixer tries to separate the sounds out as much as possible, record everything as clean as possible. I liken it to like an artist working with a palette. If they have a clean yellow, green, and blue, they can paint anything. But if those sounds are already, or if those colors are already muddied together, then you have brown, and you really can never get out of it. So by the idea of being able to have a mic here, mic here, mic here, mic here, mic here, and then playback here, 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 and then have 2 booms walking with Bob as his presence as he goes through all of these things, you can really capture that true environment. And with car sounds and people and everything else, we really, my goal is always to give post-production as many options as possible. And on this film is a real example of like throwing out microphones everywhere to capture all these little moments. And they use them so well. I have to say, this is one of the best post jobs that I've seen. A lot of times I'll see a film that I worked on and they make it too sparkly. They make it too beyond real, where they really kept it real. And that was the whole idea. Jim's whole idea was to keep it real and gritty and natural, and so that you really feel like you were there. And I think we really captured that.
It takes a village to make a village. I was waiting to use that. And not only did I put in sounds, Ted put in sounds. There were sounds directed. Todd put in sounds. I mean, we had layer upon layer upon layer of symbolic sounds. Like there's hippies singing on the street. That's the songs they're hearing on the radio. There's people outside the gaslight, waiting to get in. That's a focal point. There's vendors on the streets. There's a preacher down the corner. There's and there's people dragging up and down the street. It's just some place that doesn't exist anymore. And it really encapsulated where he was at. We really wanted to make sure people knew that this was not only a cultural event, but it was also a political event that was happening. It was social events happening. There was a unpopular war, unpopular government. There was everything was sort of happening in the 60s in that time period. And this is symbolic of sort of almost everything going on at that time. And it's nowhere now. I mean, we don't have it now. So just like we didn't have like the same impending doom that the Cuban Missile Crisis brought us in like a weekend that we all thought we were going to die. And I don't think anybody who was seeing this movie, many people, most people will not have lived through that Cuban Missile Crisis, nor will they have ever been to McDougal Street in this period. So it was really a loving tribute to that Jim shepherded through there with all these different elements.
I'm glad you brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis because we actually have that clip too. So I want to set that up. But I think that you're right, Don. I think a lot of us, a lot of people, were not around then. So they don't know kind of what we know the historical facts, but not necessarily the emotional resonance. And I think we've all seen lots of scenes in movies with, very concerned people watching news broadcasts. But, Jim takes this a step further with an amazing, sequence with Joan, like trying to get the hell out of town.
The question of immediate relief or optimism here that nobody in the White House is willing to say that any Soviet ships have come back. They do not believe that the 24 hours of waiting is over. There's still considerable belief that the confrontation in the Caribbean will come yet tonight.
Become well stocked and have adequate supplies. No one can guarantee that American families on the eastern seaboard will be alive tomorrow.
The Pentagon says the United States is ready to sink for Cuba, which refuses to stop and be searched under the blockade.
Look, I'm doing my best. Everyone's doing their best. Taxi! Coming in! Taxi! Taxi! Hey! Come on!
Here's a new one.
It's an amazing sequence, but one of the things that I really clued into was if you compare that with the other street scene that we were just talking about, I feel like I could use those two short clips to teach a masterclass in like kind of similar street scenes in New York City, but they have a very different tone and style and feel, largely because of what's happening in the track.
Most of the great filmmakers that you'd study in film school have remarkable use of sound. From Bergman to Hitchcock to Spielberg and I don't mean they did the sound. They have brilliant people who did the sound, but they did do something, which is they made movies that needed it. Meaning that there's a lot of filmmakers, and you'll hear a lot of good sounding movies where the movie is just kind of shot and then they put really cool sound on it. And, pretty much anything in a prehistoric setting with thundering rain and in, Atmos with, it's going to sound awesome. But it's not about sounding awesome is what we're not talking about. How it advances narrative. And that requires a director and editors who are using sound as a tool, and are relying upon it. It is not additive. It isn't garnish. It is the scene won't work without that sound. And that really, that's a really important thing. I've just learned watching great, I was just watching for the first time probably since I was in film school, Bergman's Persona, and the sound work on that movie is fucking incredible. And you wouldn't think it, but it's like and I kind of go just the first 10 minutes is like a tour de force of kind of sonic, experimentation and unwinding of your mood and unsettling you. And anyway, I'm really, as is visible in the movies, I'm pretty much a classicist, and I love to kind of go back to what I grew up, the kind of style I learned watching 70s movies growing up. And most of us, I kind of are from the same generation, and sound was such an elaborate tool in those movies, but there was such an incredible awareness by the filmmaker how to use the sound, how to plan the scene, to need the sound, as opposed to just dressing the scene with more stimulus, which so much of what I kind of get bored by in modern filmmaking is that I don't sometimes see it as much as technique as just hyper stimulation, that you're just getting confronted with stuff, and which feels like drama and simulates drama, but isn't, in my opinion.
Todd, the movie takes us into some really well-known historical places, like the concert venues where as I said, Carnegie Hall, obviously, that CBS recording studio where Dylan recorded his early albums. How much research did you do when you went in? You talked a little bit about having period, vintage microphones. How much research did you do about like figuring out what the original recordings had been made with, and did you match to that, or what was your approach to kind of, and also I guess like, did you feel like you had to be like really adherent to the original recording setups?
We tried to stay as close to them as we possibly could. Obviously it's hard to duplicate them entirely, but we stayed as close as we could, and from the moment that Timmy decided that he was going to go live on this thing the entire way through, and that was an evolving process. So Timmy came in and he said, as we were starting, he said, look, I've worked on this for 6.5 years. There's no way that I'm going to playback on this. So from that moment on, it was really like every day going to work was like we were recording an album, and not just any album, really an historic piece, a piece of music. And I think there's over 60 live pieces and 130 music drops on it. So it was just constant. This film is really, it's Bob and it's music, and that's it. There's nothing else. There's no other sparkle. There's nothing else. It's really as raw and as real as possible. And that was one of the things that Jim Mangold would do, is that he would want us to create as real of a concert environment as we possibly could. So we would have speakers going, we would have crowds going, we would have everything happening at the same time. And I'd be capturing all the different elements. I had probably 5 different microphones out for audience stuff. And then, like I said, I have everybody wired on stage and boomed and all of that. So whenever they went off, you'd have these transitions in sound, even when Joan is singing and she pushes the microphone to the side, you hear the difference between the older microphones and then going to what we're used to now, which is that rich, full sound. So, as of research, I would research everything, and we tried to match microphones as much as we possibly could. And just in a style that Bob is. So Bob has like 4 different voices, and capturing Timmy's voice, who replicated Bob incredibly well. But Bob had, who was a known mutterer, which is always lovely for all of us who have to record them. But he would mutter. I'd say half of his dialogue was muttering. Then he had his normal voice, which he rarely used. And then he had the twangs. He had the really like a lower twang. And then he'd have this really sarcastic twang, like, Joan, you don't know what you're doing, and that was like this piercing tone. So just capturing his voice and making him sound, who he is in every different environment was the second challenge on this film, besides the music.
Paul, there was one sequence that I really wanted to ask you about. This is sort of this is the first meeting between Bob and Sylvie, and it looks like a church where they're recording the Hootenanny. Bob has just performed, and he sees Sylvie, and he goes and sits down beside her, and they have a very quiet, whispered conversation while the Hootenanny is still going on. So you know where I'm going with this question. Yes. I was just amazed at your dexterity at making sure that we could understand what was going on while all this was happening. Talk to me about mixing that particular scene.
Yeah, thanks. So the scene starts with Bob performing. He exits stage and gets thanked. And then as he's walking toward the back of the church, there's another performance going on, or an introduction and then a performance, which I slowly took off into a lot more reverb than necessarily it needed if we weren't trying to diffuse away from that act. So that as Bob walks towards the back of the church and sits down in the pews next to Sylvie, we were already used to the idea that the performance that's going on in front of them was secondary, and it was out of focus, and it was a lot of reverb going on in the back of the church itself. And then they start talking to each other in very subdued dialogue, as you said. And so that was a challenge. So I had to what I ended up doing was compressing and pulling the mids and high frequencies out of the vocal performance side of it, of the act that was continuing in the front of the church. Pulling those way down and just sort of crushing them whenever there was any dialogue between Sylvie and Bob, and allowing the reverb to breathe more, so you still felt, as an audience watching the film, that you hadn't lost the momentum of that music performance that was going on, but there was nothing really to get in the way of the dialogue range between the two of them. And then, much to my as I was working on that, I thought, oh, good, I found a place where this is all going to be working. And then, of course, we cut to their POV, and we're really concentrating on the music going on up front. So I couldn't do that. I had to then ease my way out of that reverb and back into some sort of mid-shot performance that we would believe as a perspective. And then again, back to their dialogue towards the end. So yeah, it was a dance. It was a dance of just trying to not let the audience feel that they had lost the music and the propulsion through the scene from that music, but also totally understanding what they were saying to each other in whispered tones.
Paul, I have to say my heart went out to you because Timothée Chalamet's performance is extraordinary. I feel like he completely got into the character of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan famously is not a loud talker or a strong enunciator. So, you had your challenges to make sure that all of that came through and was intelligible.
Yeah, Timothy did a fantastic job of mumbling through some of the dialogue the way that Bob would. Yeah, that obviously that was challenging, but just trying to, along with the dialogue editorial team, we were, trying to pick out consonants and T's and D's and S's and through the normal dialogue that was very mumbled, just so that we could maintain some sort of clarity and understand what they were saying. But hats off to Timothy, because I think he didn't drop that, and he didn't just go, I'm an actor that needs to project. He just stayed in Bob's character, and then the rest was our problem.
Timmy and Edward Norton would wear these little nose plugs to give them that nasal twang. So they would let in just a certain amount of air. So they'd be off on the side, and putting these things in their nose and coming out, and they would have the twang, and it really worked.
I actually brought him in to loop some things, not because of necessarily they weren't understandable, but the level was a little low. And I thought maybe if he'd come back and re-record it, the level would be better and maybe be more clear. So he comes through and he does it, and it's even more mumbly. And it's like, oh, okay, well now it's clearly mumbly. Then he turns to me and he goes, "You get it. You know what I'm saying." And it's like, well, actually, you're right. I do.
There's a musical moment when he's on stage with Joan, and he walks off. They're playing "Just Be Baby Friends with You," I think, and he walks away from her while she's playing, and he starts singing his own new song that he wants to sing to himself. And it's a little mumbly. It's a production. It's something he did on the day, and it was a little mumbly, and it's blended with the guitar and some of the crowds. And we brought, he came back in to just do it to see if we get it clear, and everyone hated it. We wanted the mumbly performance because it felt so real, like he was in that space, and it worked so well.
Yeah, and all the conversation after that, he's all mumbling, like, "You understand me? You understand that? You all see me, right?" And it's like, we get it. The words are not there, but we get it.
We've got a pretty amazing clip this is towards the end of the film. This is the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. So Dylan is on stage at this point with his electric guitar and really, really wailing on it. We see the normally even keel Pete Seeger kind of having a little bit of a meltdown, trying to get the volume down.
This is chaos. You've got to turn it down. I can't do that. You know who I am, son. Now let me at that.
Jesus Christ, man.
Get back! Open your fucking ears, man! All right.
I don't believe
What was interesting is that Jim wanted to do that entire night piece in one shot. So it was a 23-minute scene. We did it. I don't know how many times we did it, but it started with the Railroad Gang, and then MC and Joan and Johnny, and then all the stuff that was going on in the wings and the whole thing with Pete running over and trying to shut everything down, and then Bob coming out for the second time, and then all the way through to the finale when everybody comes out and has their kumbaya moment at the end. But that was all shot as one single scene, and the audience was as big of a character as the people were on stage. So we had speakers going out, obviously, to the audience. We captured the audience in every way that we possibly could. Everybody on stage was wired. All the practical mics were all practical. And it was probably one of the most complicated and challenging and rewarding experiences, because I've never done anything like that. I thought for sure we would break it up into the segments. As I read it, normally you would break it up. You'd do the Railroad Gang, then you would do, the MCs, and then you would do Timmy, live. And then when he comes back for Baby Blue at the end, but we did it all in one straight shot, straight through. And it was, I'm back there on the faders, just going through multiple levels on my deck to get the 40 mics to bring everything up. But I think that it really worked. And, Jim loved that live element.
It's funny, the big moment, the feedback moment when he goes to the board and, tries to stop him. There's this feedback with the stage with Timmy and Pete, or Bob and Pete. It wasn't there initially. It actually wasn't designed that way. And, I always give full credit to Drew Buckland, who said, maybe there's something where he hits something and it will trigger Bob to connect to Pete. It was a way to get Bob on stage to feel Pete's effort to stop him. And once that came together, I think the whole scene suddenly lifted in this amazing way, that it felt like, oh, this is now a drama between these two people, as opposed to just a performance thing over here and then, a drama over here. But I know Don and Paul can talk more to kind of the balance of it. But that was just, I knew the backstory because Drew came to me. He's like, what if he hit something? What if there was like a circuit or something that could do that? And we played with it for a while, and Jim came in. He was like, holy shit, that's great. And it suddenly came to life.
If you see the film, obviously it makes sense. But in that little clip, there is plenty of music going on. And what's happened is that Jim decided to record the concert as one take from the beginning to end. It's a 23-minute take. And he would do that even when the action took place away from the stage. So there's a full concert going on in the background while these two guys are going at it at the mixing board. And it was like, is this, do you realize it's all bleeding through our dialogue? And, and so, but we left it like that. I mean, Pete Seeger is Pete Seeger, and he's yelling over this stuff. And that's just sort of the sort of situation that Jim created, where he would have this musical performance go on even when we weren't focused on the stage. We're focused on things backstage or in the wings, and there's conversations going on when there's music blaring behind them, and that's all real. And I had to loop some of them, but I didn't loop a lot of them. Like Pete Seeger there, I did not loop him. But it still works, and it's part of the cacophony that he's experiencing. And if you're a frog and you're in boiling water, it's like you go into the beginning of this movie and the water is really tepid. But by the time you get to the Newport at 65, the water's boiling, and that's what we're doing in this film, because it's so loud, but you've been conditioned to get to it. And we told Disney and Searchlight, and it's like, we're not going to turn it down. It's going to be loud the whole time.
Yeah, and that sequence, I believe, that's the second song in the 3-song sequence, isn't it, Ted? Yeah. So there's three songs there in the electric set, and we had to obviously start off very large to shock the audience at the Newport Folk Festival into, what the heck is going on here? Why is he being so rebellious and playing something that we don't want to hear? So we had to start very large, but we also wanted those 3 songs to build and to get more frenzied. So I didn't want to just do that with level. We did it with the PA became more of a voice of the songs. Slaps and reverbs became more of a character. And the low end through the 3 songs increases. It goes down sonically in frequency, and it also increases in intensity, and there's more compression used and things like that, just to try and build the 3 songs to a peak where you do feel like you've progressed, but it's not just gotten louder. And in that particular sequence where Pete goes back to the soundboard, I also wanted to add an element of chaos from that perspective to go along with what he was trying to do and how he wasn't succeeding. So I went into some kind of very random delays, not only the realistic PA delay and the increase in low end for the back of the field. I also wanted to create some crazy slaps going on that just made Pete even more frustrated that he couldn't find his way there. He couldn't have his way. And so that was a big part of joining in with the feedback that Dave Giamacca was mixing, and making that very loud and proud. And just really it's getting inside Pete's head, and he's hit a brick wall. He's not going to be able to get his will.
Jim, you've been working with these guys for a long time, and I would argue that it's a very, very successful collaboration. A lot of Oscar nominations along the way, and I've been just a big fan of the sound of your films, the way you use sound design to communicate story, tone, emotion. I know you do some teaching. What do you tell film students about sound as a storytelling tool?
Honestly, not much. I agree with everything you're saying, but honestly, when you're teaching young filmmakers, they're so lost in tech, whether it's like, I want to do a really complicated sound design for the scene. I'm like, you haven't shot it yet. Like, or I want to, I'm going to do this with a oneer that flies in the window and through the eye of a gnat and then comes out a martini glass. And you're like, what's the scene? And so the first thing is always to serve the story and to figure out how you can assert whatever style you want to assert in the face of the story. I think part of the success that me and these gentlemen have had, and the fun we've had over the years working on movies, is that that the way we shoot them, the way Faden and I shoot them or block them, and there's opportunities for sound, and you can be really aware when you're shooting of how to use sound, the way you shoot it and what you decide to put in the frame and not in the frame, and the way you use sound to supplement what's in the rectangle or out are really critical questions that, and you can have a certain amount of confidence sometimes about how quickly you can communicate to an audience where you are or the kind of space you're in with the right sound. Don and I go through a elaborate process, even in the editing process, where sometimes I'm really reliant upon that to the degree that, holy shit, I shot this whole sound believing we could find an ambience that's going to tell me where I am without me having to do a kind of establishing shot of this place. And I never got an establishing shot of this place and so we're suddenly searching for how to say Chinese restaurant in New York in 1962. And it's not so easy to do. It's a very complicated, like almost painterly layering of group loop and clanking of dishes, and to capture a feeling of something. I tend to not like this. I personally, it's not something I teach, but I'm not big on starting scenes with like a wide shot that tells you where you are. I think I'm traumatized by all the Aaron Spelling shows of my childhood, which always began with a shot of Joan Collins' house, and then you cut in, or a shot of the Love Boat, and then you cut in.
There's no establishing shots in your movie.
I just won't do it. And I much rather reveal your setting through kind of like an onion. As you're revealing the scene, the space reveals itself. But that, as a strategy, makes me extremely reliant upon sound as a way of bridging the gap for the audience. And there's so many incredibly immediate ways you can illuminate an audience with sound, and the right sound, that has a kind of, that can be a search for a kind of magic feather that you sometimes go, oh wow, this is hard.
Well, you guys have been super generous with your time. I really appreciate you guys talking to us. Jim, before I let you go, I know that you got to spend some time with Dylan when you were working on the script and developing the film. So I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about that experience, what it was like sitting down with the man. You know, were you starstruck? Did you have anxiety about how he was going to respond to it? How did it affect you, and how did it affect the film?
It was when COVID hit and the movie came to a grinding halt, and I had been writing a script for this movie that in some ways was starting to alarm some of Dylan's people, because it was getting into more personal stuff than they had anticipated being in the film. And then COVID happened, and it made whatever reservations people were having irrelevant. And, but also when COVID happened, it ended up that Bob had a tour that got canceled, and he asked to read the script that were troubling some of his management team. And he liked it. And so he asked to meet with me, and we proceeded to have about 4 meetings, that we just got together and met during COVID, during lockdown. And it was an incredible opportunity to kind of, first of all, he's a big movie fan. I found Johnny Cash was too. Like, the first thing he said to me is like, "Oh, I love that movie Caplan, man." And you're like, whoa, like, you're kind of like, this is a little, so if anything, if I was nervous before, he quickly made me not nervous by kind of revealing he loves movies and is fascinated by them. And that's true of many musicians. I mean, there's an incredible strong relationship, you know, between songwriters and the movies. But so it was just a really illuminating series of meetings in which they were just purely additive about telling me little, you know, kind of things that a biographer would never put in a book, but that if you're recreating his world, were really important. But the most important thing I got out of him was just the sense of him wanting a band was so much more innocent as he remembers it, than meaning he was just lonely, meaning that he felt he'd always loved, you know, rock and roll, Little Richard, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Elvis Presley. He'd always loved band music, and he didn't go to New York with the intention of becoming the greatest solo artist ever in the world. So that some of the kind of idea of him going electric, I think, is a little less a guy like a kind of master plan of societal change, and more a guy who, at least what I got the feeling from him, was a guy who's gotten really successful and doesn't know who to trust, and kind of feels overwhelmed, and everyone wants something. And nothing felt quite as good as hanging out with an organ player, a drummer, and a guitar player in a blank room with coffee and cigarettes. And that felt like home to him. And that made him feel alive again. And they were people he could trust, because all they wanted was to know their charts for the next tune. And it was not, it wasn't about what can I have this song? Can you help me with this date? Can you lend me money? It was just pure music. And that was really illuminating working on it. Lastly, Glenn, I do want to say these gentlemen on with me have been working with me for a long time. And I think the thing that I'm sure they've spoken about our relationship and the working processes, but the thing I cherish that we all share is not just the kind of my own classical sensibility, because they work on a lot of films, but we all share a kind of love of getting the basics right, and that you can be showy after you get the basics right. Like, you don't put cheese sauce all over it until you've managed to cook it perfectly. And that's a place that we're all very united, and we don't have to talk much about it. Like and that's partly how it answers your first question of how we move so fast, is that we all pretty much know. If I'm in a jam with how to solve music on something, I kind of know if I can give Ted 48 hours, he's going to give me some incredible options. And if I'm going crazy with the balance of sound in a scene, I know if I probably give Paul a little break from me and just let him have the mix for a few hours, he's going to find his way through this if we all just stop talking for a little while. And and in Don's case, it's just this forever search for that sound. and also he has an extreme sensitivity about performance, and so much of a world like this as you created is not only the right sound, but also the quality of the group loop and the background sounds and the stuff which actually create, which you would be shocked at how much a difference it makes with effective group loop or non-effective group loop in terms of the credibility or realism of a scene.
Many thanks to Todd, Ted, Don, Paul, and James, of course, for joining us on the show today. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Searchlight Pictures for helping us juggle everyone's very busy schedules to put this conversation together. Be sure to check out A Complete Unknown, available in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos when it premieres in the U.S. theaters on Christmas Day. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you're subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube and our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.